Hi everyone. I'm starting off this commentary series with a topic that has been pretty much done to death by other uploaders at this point. But since I didn't tackle this on my review of the game too much, I decided to do it anyway. So, today I'm going to talk about what I personally do and don't like about Dark Souls 2 from the PvP perspective. Before I start, I want to mention that I understand that Souls community is a very passionate one, and some of my opinions may differ from some of yours. But that's all those are, just my opinions, and you are allowed to have yours. But let's try to keep the comment section civil, okay? The footage you see on the background is just some random PvP clips I've recorded. Also, take note that if you're watching this video on a later date, the version we currently have while this video is recorded is 1.03 with the calibrations of 1.07 and no DLCs are out yet. I will split this video into positives and negatives. So let's start with the negatives. Infinite stun locks. This is a nasty issue many people were not too happy to see when hopping into Dark Souls 2 PvP. There were infinite stun locking in Dark Souls 1 as well, but in that game we had a glitch called toggle escaping that helped people to avoid getting stun locked to death in one succession. In Dark Souls 2 we don't have toggle escape, and since poise acts very differently than it did in the first game, this is a major issue that I would suspect is getting fixed in the future patches. At least I hope so. I've always wondered about existence of stun locks in Souls games in general. I would much more prefer there to be just a stun, you know? Getting stunned for one hit only. Stunning would still be highly useful since you can interrupt your opponent with it. And I hope they will find a better balance with stunning in the future Souls games. And I think From Software should have learned about toggle escape to somehow implement it more efficiently in the game as a proper mechanic. Manually directing attacks. This is something that has been made quite sluggish compared to the first game, and for some reason it seems that they purposefully wanted to limit the players about manually directing their attacks, which is no doubt one of the biggest gripes I have with the game. It still works with some of the weapons, but with others it's near to impossible to do fluidly, limiting the potential of some weapons. Hit detection. Now this is something that is way more clear problem with only a certain few weapons, and I'm very tempted on doing some testing whether some of the hitboxes of the weapons are the cause of this. But the hit detection of some attacks in the game can be very odd at times. Easy example of this is the Greatsword class running attack, that just constantly keeps hitting me from almost the double of the length of the visible blade of the weapon. This accompanied with it being a certain 3-hit combo doesn't make the issue any better. This might also be caused by lag or latency, but since the problem is so consistently popping up with fighting against certain few of the weapons, I really doubt it. Poor tracking of the heavier weapons. Although I like some of the things they did with the tracking in the game, I cannot really understand why they chose to make the tracking of the slowest weapons so much worse compared to the most of the weapons. You need to be way more specific of where you aim your attacks with the heavier weapons, or you will constantly find yourself wondering why your attack didn't land, because the tracking doesn't really do any of the work for you. There are also faster weapons like spears and rapiers that also have pretty awful tracking. But that is quite understandable since they are thrusting weapons and relatively fast on recovering if you should miss. Covenant problems. Overall, I think covenants in Dark Souls 2 work better than in the first game. But there are some things about them that make me raise my eyebrow. Firstly, I think it was heartbreaking to see Gravelord Covenant not returning from Dark Souls 1. Since the concept of that covenant was fantastic, but it worked poorly in the first game. They could have brought it back and make it actually work this time, But for some reason they decided to replace it with the Rat King Covenant that in my opinion isn't nearly as interesting idea as Gravelording was. Also, why don't the Invasion Covenants have an infinite invasion item in the endgame? Invasion items cost ridiculously high amount of souls, and only other way for Red Phantoms to get cracked Red Eye Orbs is to go to the arena to duel, which, let's be honest, is something many people dislike to do at this point, for quite a few reasons, which I talk more about a bit later in this video. It also makes very little sense that the blues need items to duel in their arena when reds don't. Why did they want to make the PvP so hard to do at times, when it's obviously one of the major things that makes the flame of these games burning for years after the release? Critical damage. Let's face it, critical damage in this game is unbelievably strong, and by critical damage I mean card break, backstab and riposte damage. Don't get me wrong, I think all of these critical attacks should do more damage than regular hits, but the damage some of these weapons like dagger can deal with criticals is off the charts insane and makes the first Dark Souls Hornet Chaos Rapier feel like mosquito sting in comparison. I hope they address the critical damage values in the future patches, or soon there is no people riposting with anything else than one-shotting daggers. Elemental weapons. This is one of the things that disappointed me the most, just because we were over this shit already in Dark Souls 1. When the game first came out, there were no reason to go with anything else than elemental weapons, because those required no stat scaling. But the balance got fixed later with the patch. However, in Dark Souls 2 it seems we have to go through this shit once again, because elemental weapons are again made dominant in PvP. This time we at least have scaling on the weapons, but since you can buff elemental weapons, and stacking elemental defenses is way harder than stacking physical defense, just makes magic builds the most optimal choice no matter how you look at it. There has been some fixes on balance according to this issue though, but I would still like to see the ability to buff elemental weapons removed completely from the game. Spices. Adding spices to the game is by far one of the most stupid things in Dark Souls 2. Who could possibly think that adding an item that makes you get the spells without stat requirements is a good thing? Spices might work in the game if they would only apply to the spells that scale with the given character's stats. But I guess they didn't think too much about the buffs, did they? Luckily they clearly have seen the issues with this, and some nerfs to buff duration without given stats were implemented. But if you ask me, the amount of spices you can use to get spells should be lowered. Soul Memory. So, the root of most of the problems PvP community is having at the moment. Soul Memory was no doubt implemented in the game with the good intentions, to prevent overgeared people to invade less progressed players. But sadly, now would be the time to admit that this shit just doesn't work, and causes way more problems than it should. I know that not everyone agrees with the soul level metas that we had in the first game, but I'm one of those players who supports soul level matchmaking. To me it just makes sense, and I think it worked as well as it possibly could in the first game. Now you are just constantly thrown against players that can be hundreds of soul levels above you, ripping away all the possible fairness out of the game that doesn't really pride itself with balance to begin with. In the end, I believe most people who enjoy PvP like to play with builds. Like actual builds. Not with superior machines that have absolutely everything. If this would really be the case, Dark Souls 1 meta soul level would have been max level. But it wasn't. People didn't want it, and I don't think people want it in this game either. I think the existence of soul memory could be kept intact for the new game only, but I think soul level matchmaking should kick in at least when going into NG+. I really hope FromSoft realizes this problem and does something about it, especially now that levels matter way more than in the previous game. So, those were my biggest problems in Dark Souls 2 PvP. There would be some smaller gripes I have considering specific items in the game. But in order to make this video to stay in reasonable length, I hop into positive things now. Magic. I really like how much more viable spells are compared to the first game. There were some useful spells in the first game too, but those were very limited, and landing a successful hit with most castings was more of a matter of lag than anything else. In Dark Souls 2, castings are way more better done and have less to do with lag. Some might argue that some damage values need a second look, and I agree. But overall, I'm happy how the castings are implemented in the game. Especially now that the casting speed is determined by attunement instead of dexterity, as it weirdly was in the first game. Stamina management. Stamina management is clearly placed in a bigger role in Dark Souls 2, and I really like that there are actually harder consequences for running out of stamina, by adding the card crush and exhaustion time in the game. More viable weapons. Although there are obvious weaker weapons too in the game, I'm very impressed by the overall amount of competent weapons. I'm way less often left with the feeling, "This weapon sucks!" than I was in Dark Souls 1. Although this might change when the PvP scene gets more competent. But we'll see. Dual wielding. Now, to be completely honest, I haven't experimented too much with the dual wielding myself yet, but I'm still happy that it's in the game, and definitely brings up more build variety and depth to PvP. Roll distances and adaptability. I'm still a bit torn about the subject of adaptability and agility. On other days I feel that implementing iframes as a separate stat is a bad idea. But seeing it working in action often makes perfect sense. I like to think they did with the roll distances, and I think it brings another nice layer to the combat, making the rough caps of roll speeds less present, and making the roll distance the main focus. Card breaking. This is another new mechanic I really like, although I don't like the animation of it. I think the kick in Dark Souls 1 would have been way more cooler animation than the pimp slap we have now, but it is what it is. Card break acts as a new element to fighting against turtles, when in the first game you had very limited options on how to approach them, especially if there was a good player on the other side of the shield. Now you have one more option. Backstabs. This is a bit odd, because I don't necessarily completely like how backstabs were implemented in this game, but I like what the aftermath of it is. Since backstab isn't so ridiculously dominant anymore, all kind of attacking is actually more viable now. While in the first game attacking was less viable and punishing other players' attacks with a backstab was, it made a large variety of weapons or attacks in the game almost completely unusable. I kinda like that you need to go through this little animation to land a successful stab in Dark Souls 2. But on the other hand, it leads to situations where you didn't even try to backstab your opponent, but it still activated the failed backstab animation, leaving you vulnerable. So far I'm enjoying how the new backstab is implemented, but I may change my mind in the future. Remains to be seen. Throwing weapons. I like how Dark Souls 2 made throwing weapons actually worth a damn, and that there is large variety of those, bringing another extra layer to the PvP, acting as a free form of ranged combat to any build. Backstepping. Backstepping could be used somewhat effectively with some of the weapons in the first game as well. But in Dark Souls 2 those have actually quite large amount of iframes, adding a whole new element to the spacing in the game. And since I like to use backstep attacks a lot in Dark Souls, I'm very happy to see them made more effective in Dark Souls 2. 4 ring slots. I'm very happy about this one. I think having 4 ring slots brings a lot more variety to the table. And even though one could argue that there are still these must-have rings like Third Dragon Ring, the overall balance of the rings is more satisfying than it was in the first game. Defense matters. Again, this also has its downsides. But I like how defense actually matters in this game, and people don't, for obvious reasons, pick their armor pieces just to hit certain poise breakpoints anymore, like it was on Dark Souls. And lastly, Fashion Souls. Please don't think I'm shallow, but I like pretty things, and I think armor design was a huge step forward from the first game. And being a huge Fashion Souls guy myself, I cannot leave this out of the list. The game has absolutely fantastic looking armor pieces, and on top of that, better character creation. So, that is for my little commentary of today. Hopefully I got most of my points across, and hopefully we see changes to some of the problems that I mentioned here. I consider myself very lucky, since I'm able to enjoy the PvP of both Dark Souls games, which isn't the case with all the players. So, hopefully you enjoyed the commentary, and please, if you have a suggestion for a future topic of discussion, let me know about it in the comment section, and I might tackle that subject in the future. I aim to answer as many comments as I can, and I'm very interested to hear what you people on the other side of the screen have to say. So please share your opinions in the comment section. Take care.